Hey everyone, we are back and we are talking today on the Regenerative Agriculture Club podcast with Brian Estes. He is leading the team at LINC Foods in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm thrilled to be able to connect with Brian here today. Brian, thanks so much for being able to hang out today.
Yeah, likewise, Don. Thanks.
We were kind of talking offline about how to communicate the work that you all are doing, but before we do that, I kind of want to start at step one. And learn more about your personal story into your space, because everybody kind of comes into the world of regenerative ag, sustainable food production in different angles, different processes, in different times of their life. And so I'm curious to hear more about how you personally came into the space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think kind of first things first for me, I'm a lifetime Eastern Washingtonian. So live in the Northwest, but east of the Cascade Mountain Range, where it's a lot of high desert. Here in the Spokane area where I live now, it's all ponderosa pine forests, kind of transitional, getting into the mountains as you're approaching the Rockies of Western Montana. But yeah, lived in a couple different places in Eastern Washington, but lived here all my life. And the region's got several kind of major agricultural ecosystems, I guess you could call them, between the dryland grain farming of the Palouse down into the Mid-Columbia Basin along the Snake and Columbia Rivers and up into the Yakima Valley, where you see a little bit of everything as far as specialty crops, from like classic vegetables and tree fruit to hops to wine grapes. As a consequence, I think fortunate to have grown up in and around a lot of different forms of farming and agriculture are happening at all sorts of different scales and going to a variety of markets. I think it's more than 90% of the wheat grown in Washington state is exported. The amount of apples and other tree fruit that go into global markets is enormous. But then there's also, super robust, direct kind of farm to table culture, whether you're talking about Yakima Valley hops going into craft beer, or the diversity of farmers markets and CSAs and all that. So it's a really interesting and fascinating part of the Northwest to be from, and I think pretty different in a lot of ways than what folks picture when you're talking about the Pacific Northwest. But yeah, I grew up, my mom's family's from the Walla Walla Valley in southeastern Washington originally, and grew up spending a lot of time with my grandparents who were farming wheat and peas up in the foothills of the Blue Mountains, selling those products at a commodity scale, where when harvest was done and the trucks left the farm and went down to the elevator, that was kind of the end of the connection to the product. But ended up getting interested in food and ag myself from a totally different and non-farming perspective, where I kind of fell in love with the end uses of food and the community impacts of whether it's sharing a meal with friends or thinking about how community comes together around food. And in my early 20s, got really, really keen and interested in how the way we do food and the way we do farming affects the health and well-being of our local community. And I think was looking for something pretty hands-on and tangible to do in terms of that conversation. And so got involved at first with some nonprofit work doing urban agriculture, spent a few years operating my kind of evening and weekend job, my own little specialty produce operation, selling to the restaurant scene here in Spokane, which for those who don't know Spokane's a city of, I think it's probably pushing 240,000 folks, probably about 500,000 people in the greater metro area. So not a small town in a lot of ways. But yeah, really fell in love with agriculture despite having grown up around it through my love for what you get to do with the stuff coming out of the fields. So that's kind of my background.
So when you grew up as a child, I'm curious of this. So because I grew up in the central part of the United States, and so I grew up in a rural community. So I understand like growing up in agriculture, but I grew up in like soybean and corn farming country, livestock, things like that. So I'm curious from your standpoint, like just as you were growing up in the space, I mean, I just wanted, and I guess personally, I want to hear about, within that region, the Pacific Northwest, like how this whole movement towards more localized food production and more regenerative practices has evolved over the time that you've been there in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think, not unlike any other big, set of forces or trends or what have you, I perceive where the kind of food system and agricultural landscape looks now is just shaped by so many different dynamics and trains of thought. But, I definitely see agriculture in Eastern Washington probably over the last 50 to 70 years, especially as like large scale irrigation projects and stuff came into flow, and as transportation infrastructure just really developed a capacity to move product quickly and long distances. Some of the overall prevailing, I think, economic forces have really pushed ag to get, pretty big, pretty consolidated, very specialized. And I think that's created a lot of value and impact for the region in a lot of ways. But I also think it's probably played a pretty strong role in shrinking the number of ways that folks can farm, and as a consequence, the number of folks who are farming. And really probably since the 70s and certain pockets of the inland Northwest and Eastern Washington, but definitely over the last 20, 25 years, whether it's folks who were from multi-generation farming families that were small and wanted to stay small, or folks doing the back to the land thing, or more recently, young people saying, I want to leave the city and do something that's more connected to the earth. I think that, there's been a response, and I think a lot of it is, there's a lot of values driven stuff going on, but there's also just a lot of economic opportunity for saying, what would it take and what would it look like in a region like ours to be able to continue to farm at a relatively small and a more diversified scale. And that's the space that I live in and work in, is really thinking about how, as the broader culture and society says, hey, wait a minute, like we want to be connected to where our food comes from. What opportunities does that create for, new economic models for people to do business, and how does that shape how they're farming and how they're approaching, how they practice agriculture. So does that get at your question?
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious to hear more, because you mentioned like the economic models of this as well, because I know this, like, just personally, like it's really easy to be persuaded by the romance of this whole industry, but there's still a business need. I mean, if you're going to be profitable, and the numbers have to make sense, and so how do you go about that? Or maybe like how do you kind of interact with growers that are, or maybe new people that are coming in this space, and how they should be thinking about this from a business perspective, because then that's a key element of this whole space.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So I think to kind of dig in a little bit to what my work is currently focused on now, as a way to frame an anecdote for that, I suppose. So one of the LINC Cooperative's primary enterprises is we operate a malting facility, malting being the process that barley or other cereal grains to undergo to really be in the format that a brewer or a distiller would need the grain to be to work with it to make beer or whiskey. And what got LINC into doing that processing was driven by our mission of saying, how do we identify market opportunities, especially just right here in the Northwest, for crops that are being grown in our region, but where there are maybe major barriers for any grower to tap into them, and where the idea of that farm identity as something that's really been put into the center spotlight of our cultural values of saying we want to know where our food comes from. How do we look for those market opportunities where being able to tell the story of the grower, there's a lot of potential there, but there's also major barriers. And in malting, basically what it comes down to is you can be, the world's best barley farmer, but if you don't have the processing infrastructure and acumen to get that grain ready to make beer, you're not going to be selling it to a brewer anytime soon. So I think as far as why sharing that is significant to the question of, what is the economic landscape or the business opportunities, that cereal grain production has been really driven by big and just fully globalized at this point markets and a real commodity framework, where barley in Eastern Washington is almost kind of a nearly extinct crop functionally, because where it had been a super valuable rotation against wheat, but totally linked to the value of feed grain could just no longer compete with other commodities, corn, soy, et cetera. And so it was like, well, if we can't make a profit growing this stuff, we can't grow it. And so from a agricultural stewardship perspective, from just a good, farming sense perspective, that tool in the toolkit of growing barley in our region is like slowly kind of disappeared. And so that's a market force at work in terms of how people are farming. And what we're interested in doing is saying, we've got a high value opportunity, something that we can take. If you're that you know how to grow great barley, we can take that and create a new market space that's free of some of those pressures, and really trying to capitalize on the business opportunity to support a grower and support their stewardship practices. So, I mean, I really think that we're a very much a mission and values driven company, but we're in business, and we're trying to think about how we can navigate those market realities to support the viability of our growers, and to create spaces for new growers to step in as well. I think that's another key variable of all of that is how participating in those big established systems or not corresponds to the scale that you need to be at to be effective, how well capitalized you need to be right out of the gate, and especially for certain crops and systems of ag, the barriers to entry are just completely nuts. So thinking about what we can do to reshape that, where we've got grain production in our region is typically done on pretty significant acreage. We're talking thousands of acres, and we've got a couple growers that are farming at pretty decent scale. But then we've also got a couple growers that are producing barley at a really small scale, where it would make no sense at all for them to say, well, yeah, I'm just going to sell this down to the elevator at feed price. They've got to have a premium to be doing what they're doing at the scale they are. And, we're proud to be there to help facilitate that.
This is a great entry point into kind of taking a deep dive on LINC Foods. So certainly I've been personally a fan of all of the work that you do, and I admire everything you guys are doing within that region. I'm very envious of that. In fact, I wish I lived in the region that you guys are at to capitalize on all that you're doing. But for somebody that's just coming in this and learning more about what LINC Foods is, how do you describe like what it is that you do and who you serve?
Yep. Yeah. So LINC formed as a farmer and worker-owned cooperative with the intent of operating an agricultural business that really kept the folks creating the value from the ground up at the very center of whatever success we were able to have. And where we have focused our energy is on that idea of where there's this pretty established, but I would say still growing and emerging market or set of markets that say, we want to be as connected to where our food is coming from as possible. We want to know the farmer. And we're something different than we need a different infrastructure set up than a farmer's market, where people just pull up and have stuff off the back of their trucks, and I can walk up and buy it, and cash changes hands, and we're good to go. That same set of values, but saying, yeah, but I serve 20,000 meals a day because I'm a school district, or I'm a brewer and I can't just buy grain as it is coming off the farm. I need it to undergo that processing stage. Where we see these great opportunities for to respond to the broadening interest in maintaining farm identity, having unique and high quality products, but where there's some sort of barrier to that, making that farm to table connection realized. So that's really what we're in the business of doing, is supporting our cohort of growers here in the Inland Northwest to access those new sorts of markets. And that looks like that's I think one of the things that makes us distinct is it's that idea, rather than saying, well, we want to be a company that sells the most apples or the most potatoes or the most cherries or the most barley. It's trying to support a region of agricultural producers to connect to markets where there's a shared kind of value and vision for what our food system can look like. So when we got started in 2014, it was really in response to a couple large scale food service entities that were looking at what was going on, whether it was farmers markets or there was a handful of really dynamic farm to table style restaurants that had opened up that were really placing front and center their connection to the farms. And the university food service said, we're hearing that our students coming through the dining hall at the university, they're looking for the same thing when they come to us. And all of our established providers, suppliers, are the wholesale distributors, they can't necessarily tell us where any of what they're bringing us comes from, and we want to change that. We're going to give business to whomever can solve that riddle, but we need a middleman to do it, and so we can't call up one farmer at a time like that restaurant can. And so a group of growers and a couple food entrepreneurs who are Spokane locals and looking to help shake things up here in our region said, well, shoot, maybe we can do that, on our own behalf. So launched a small specialty wholesale distribution outfit where we sourced from our growers, where we were, having them tell us what they had available that day, that week, that month, that year. Take all that information, take it to that, the chef at the university or at the hospital or at the hotel, say, here's all the products I've got here. You can see which farm it's from. They tell us what they want. We let the grower know. It comes into our warehouse and it goes out on our trucks, and take that process and repeat it, every day of the year. That was kind of our core initial business. We recognized pretty quickly that the opportunity for moving cereal grains in our region was huge because of where we're at, and because of the talent and of the farmers, the quality of the farming conditions for growing wheat, barley, et cetera. That's what's got us into the malting facility I've been talking about. And then especially over the last couple of years, as the way people eat their meals, whether it's not going out to restaurants as much or just thinking about how they're sourcing and who they're sourcing from, we've started doing a whole lot of direct to consumer. So kind of like a multi-farm CSA sort of subscription format, but all sorts of produce, but then animal protein, eggs, dairy, you name it. So I've really gotten into that space of making an effective kind of grocery shopping model for folks where it's all being sourced locally and that farm identity is being carried through. So a couple different businesses that we operate at this point. And I'll say really quickly, and we can talk about this more if you want. And the other thing that we feel really fortunate to be doing now in the context of our company and our farmers navigating the disruptions of COVID, but also because we are proud to be creating just a new resource and support, as we actually have both initially in contract with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but now at the state level with our Washington State Department of Agriculture, who's responsible for a fair amount of the emergency food programming in the state, are one of, I think it's about at this point, 25 or 30 contractors who are supplying Washington grown fresh produce into like the food banking system. So we've got our trucks going all over Eastern Washington, helping respond to the uptick that's been seen as far as folks facing food insecurity because they lost their job, et cetera. But not only being able to make sure there's enough food, but making it high quality, fresh produce that system isn't necessarily been accustomed to being able to, have easy access to. So that's turned into another kind of critical part of our operation, and something that we feel is we're pretty grateful for the innovation from the State Department of Agriculture and a bunch of other partners to see this opportunity where it's not just the biggest grocer retails who have excess product that they want to donate, or the biggest farms, but farms that look like ours, to be able to say, yeah, we can help make sure that our neighbors and community members are being well fed. So, yeah.
Yeah, you brought up a good point there in terms of like geographical footprint. So can you clarify that in terms of like who you all serve and like to what reach? And you mentioned the Eastern Washington, but what does that look like for folks that may be interested?
For sure. Yeah. So we're based and warehoused in Spokane, Washington. So northeastern Washington State, on the Interstate 90 that kind of crosses the state east to west. It's about a 4.5 hour drive from Seattle, just going due east. If you stay on I-90, the next city larger than Spokane you hit is Minneapolis. So a bit of a decent sized urban island out in the middle of kind of the Intermountain West, I guess you'd say, or the beginnings of that region. But so that's our home base, and because it is a major urban center for the region. We work with, I'd say it's, between 60 and 70 farms across our business lines. And over the course of a given year, there definitely, there's a greatest density within maybe like a half an hour to an hour drive of Spokane. You get outside of Spokane, and it gets agricultural pretty darn fast. But really sourcing from greater Eastern Washington, North Idaho. We also, and this as I'm looking out the windows, it's snowing, and looking ahead to the first quarter of the calendar year, as specialty produce gets harder to come by locally. We're not directly affiliated, but what I would consider sibling or kindred farmer cooperatives in Missoula, Montana, as well as north of Seattle, that have a very similar business model, the Western Montana Growers Cooperative and Puget Sound Food Hub, that we send each other pallets of stuff, especially in the course of the winter, when it's like, well, we've got lots of carrots and you're out over there, but you've got that, fall planted broccoli that you can harvest in March out of the Skagit Valley, that if a grower here tried to do it, they just have a field of dead broccoli by February because it would all flow out. But yeah, so our procurement is primarily Eastern Washington, with some key partnerships in the greater Northwest, still just, within a 4-hour drive of here. And then as far as our distribution territory, that really varies by the business line. So that direct-to-consumer program, which the main product is called LINC Box, that's offered just in the greater Spokane metro area. So we've got our trucks that do those distributions and drop points all over town and over into Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The wholesale services over the years, the geography has kind of flexed and flowed right now with that contract with the State Department of Agriculture. We're going down into southeastern Washington, into north central Washington, so covering a pretty decent amount of territory. And then the malting enterprise, malt is a very shelf-stable product and something that is a large volume kind of products. We're shipping that by the pallet or the full truckload in some cases. And, the majority of our customers are in Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, but we're doing quite a bit of business up and down the West Coast and have a few customers, further afield. I think the farthest we are shipping product regularly right now is into Pennsylvania. So that kind of goes everywhere. And that's just the nature of how that product and the market space is different than selling produce.
You mentioned the 60 to 70 farms that you work with. Can you kind of give like a profile overview of like what those farms look like in terms of like veg, animal protein, anything else that's involved, value-added products? So what's the makeup there?
Yeah. So we're fortunate in our region that, especially across greater Eastern Washington, outside of stuff like avocados and citrus, where you really need warm temperatures and not cold temperatures, you can grow just about anything in Eastern Washington. So, and that's reflected in our grower cohort. So the full spectrum of fruits and vegetables. Work with ranchers and livestock producers to produce pretty much all beef, pork, chicken. We've got a fishing vessel that they're based here in the region. They go out and fish out on the coast, but so we've got salmon that they go out and catch in August and bring back here. Dairy products, processed cheeses, all that sort of stuff. We've got specialty flours where growers are milling their own grain. All the legumes, lentils, garbanzo beans. It's really kind of the whole spectrum of crops. That I guess the other thing is that as a consequence of that, what defines a small, medium, or large sized farmer in any one segment, whether you're an orchardist or you grow specialty produce or you raise cattle, it's like the acreage or the size is going to be dramatically different based on exactly what you're talking about. So we see that reflected, but then also it's, I think we've got a fair amount of diversity even. And like with specialty produce, we've got folks that are basically in the, on the urban edge of Spokane that might be growing a quarter acre of produce and is doing a couple specialty high value crops. But then we've got folks out in the basin that are, growing 50 acres of vegetables. So big spectrum there. And similarly, so, even our cereal grains, which is one of the things I think is hardest to do at a diversity of scale, where we've got, growers that are farming thousands of acres of grain and a grower that's probably farming less than 50. Yeah, the spectrum's kind of all over the place, which is a lot of fun. And, every farmer's different, and that's there's no shortage of that diversity amongst our group of folks. So yeah.
I'm curious how you're spending your days right now. So we're recording this now in late December. And typically, when I was in more of the full time growing stage, this is the time I'd be walking into chefs and pulling out seed catalogs and going through that, planning out for the next year ahead. So where's the time being allocated right now?
For sure. Yeah. And that, we definitely, on the whole, there's plenty of kind of seasonal flux and where certain times of the year more or less focused on certain tasks or activities and what sort of hours you're working and all that. Definitely for annual crops and the high perishable stuff, there's a fair amount of conversation and planning that's going into saying, well, what's 2022 going to look like, and what does that mean for decisions that need to be made now, need to be made in April. So come October, we've got what we're looking for. The bulk of my work with the malting enterprise, there is a fair amount of crop planning that goes into saying, what's the overall acreage, but also one of the things we specialize in, the malts we produce are made by a specific variety of barley being the major cereal grain that's used for malt production. Which is very different than what the industry does on the whole. And we do that because we find there's some really interesting flavor contributions to the end product.
Can you talk more about that? Because I'll admit, like, I'm very much an amateur on that topic, and I'm really curious to hear more personally about that.
Yeah. So I think the critical thing to know about, well, when you hear the word malt or malt barley or malt grain, what is that? What are you talking about?
Because we hear those as buzzwords, right? But I think as the consumer, we don't really know what that means.
Yeah, 100%. So the role that malted barley, the foundational role that it plays, that no other ingredients that go into beer or spirits play, is that it is where the sugar comes from that brewer or distiller is going to use to do fermentation. This fermentation is, you create this sweet liquid, you pitch yeast, and that's what the yeast feed on to produce alcohol. So if you want an alcoholic beverage, you got to have sugar coming from somewhere. And especially with beer, malt is the source of that. And the trick is that your barley coming out of the field has that inherent potential of all these stored carbohydrates, but they're in their storage stage where they're these long, complex carbohydrates that would be, if you gave those to yeast to chew on, they would get some energy and be able to convert it and all of that. But it would be a slow and kind of messy process, so to speak. But so somebody a gazillion years ago got some of their barley that they were using to make fermented porridge or what have you, got some of it wet, and it sprouted, and they found that it made better fermented porridge. And that's the malt industry was born, at the beginning of time. But so the process that we do when we say we are malting barley, malting as an action, is taking the grain, steeping it in water, and then letting it germinate, which is the natural thing that a seed wants to do when it gets wet, right? And then when it gets to the right spot, drying it out so it's then shelf stable and maximally useful to the brewer. And then the amazing thing is that it's then that natural process of germination that a seed undergoes that takes those stored complex carbohydrates and gets them ready to be chopped up into the simple sugars that are ideal for fermentation. So we're really just saying, all right, seed, do what you normally do, and we're going to try to control those conditions a little bit, and then we're going to stop it at just the right moment. And that gives us the product the brewer needs. At the most functional, foundational, that's what malting is about, is helping a brewer or distiller produce alcohol through fermentation. Now, the other thing that the grain does is it adds flavor. And to be real honest, that's something that outside of it trying to make it taste the same way every time is something that the commodity malting industry and really the brewing industry for a long time, especially in the US, that's big time backseat to being, give me as much sugar as possible, make it as predictable as possible, make it as easy to work with as possible, to the detriment of where flavor's kind of an afterthought. And it's like, all we care about is that, our pick your, macro scale beer of choice, Coors, Budweiser, whatever. It's just got to taste the same way every time. And we got, like, part of what we saw in the opportunity of making malt was a craft beer industry that's incredibly robust here in the Northwest, and that is very interested in flavor, and understands that comes from the farm because of the Yakima Valley's reputation as a global leader in hops production, to say, oh, it's possible to have interesting ingredients and have them have their roots in what the farmer is doing to make beer more interesting or more dynamic or more unique or have more of a story. And craft beer has been, growing up over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And the entire time, the grain they've had to work with is the same stuff that is going to those big macro beers that's intended to not be that interesting. So one of the things that we're trying to do is kind of turn that idea on its head and say, no, barley can be interesting. It can be dynamic. It can have unique flavors. Yeah, we're going to do all of that technical, important stuff for you as well. But let's build on this idea of what craft beer has been exploring in the US and say, well, what's really possible with all this? And at the same time, we're going to make sure that you've got a connection to the farmer. So if he wants to come into your tap room and drink a beer made with his grain, you know who he is. Or if you want to come out for harvest, that you get to have that connection. And that's a totally different experience than what brewers are used to, that level of connection. So that's what malting is, and kind of how we're thinking about it. And we produced a first batch of malt. It would have been May of 2016. So 5.5 years ago, going on 6 years ago. And at that time, the category of malting facility that would be called craft malt. So, very in a similar vein to craft beer, but at a much smaller scale than the handful of very large facilities that exists now at the commodity scale in North America. And at the time, 2016, when we were coming on board, I think we were the 11th or 12th or maybe the 13th craft malt house on the continent. So it was very brand new baby industry, very nascent. I think now it's more like 60 or 70 operational craft malt houses. So there's definitely been this proliferation over the last few years. And it really kind of feels like the party's just sort of getting started as far as brewers being able to wrap their heads around what the potential is, and that we're creating a quality enough, reliable enough, approachable enough product as us and our fellow craft malt houses, that I just think that, I think the next 5 years, next 10 years, there's going to be a really big sea change in how people are thinking about malt as an ingredient especially for craft beer and spirits.
Well, you mentioned that, and I thought, like, it seems like it's very early stage. So there's probably so much more yet to come. And who knows where this industry is going to go. So, going forward now in the years ahead, like, what are the big industry trends, both in the craft malt brewing, but just like general, regenerative ag across the Pacific Northwest? Like, what are you seeing that we should kind of be focusing on, or what does the industry need in the years ahead?
Yeah, so I think from a producer standpoint, a couple just immediate top of mind things for me are, I do perceive that there's this sort of, somebody can, whether if it's an existing farmer, somebody can have great farming expertise, but need to be figuring out how to do this specialty, new emerging market opportunity well. Or if they're new to farming, there's a heck of a learning curve there, but that come in from either direction. I'm just seeing more and more kind of resources and like a maturity of how to participate in the sort of market segments that LINC works in to really be successful in that regard. I think in addition to that, hopeful, though I think it's going to, be an uphill climb in some ways, really trying to broaden the conversation about who's farming and what it means to be able to farm and enter into agriculture. And I just hope that we kind of keep pushing on that conversation, because it's a all hands on deck thing in my mind. We need people who want to be farming. We need to be, pushing and advocating for that to be possible and approachable. I think from the perspective of as a food hub, or just as a agricultural enterprise, kind of working in between the farmer and whatever the end use is. we spend so much of our time now talking about how to take the great ideas that we've landed on and how do we make them efficient, effective, consistent, and where we're doing them in a way that financially we can continue to scale, and in some ways where I think where we can we continue to scale to make sure that we're truly doing things in a long-term financially viable format. I know right now the malting operation is trying to figure out what its next phase of growth looks like, and I think it's going to probably be a pretty big jump in our just our production capacity. But figuring out how to do that well and to make sure that we've got the right systems and tools in place, and the right resources backing that effort, I think it's just going to be really, really critical to taking some of this, opportunity that is out there, but to really be able to seize it. And I know, it's a simple thinking about some of the specialty produce work that we do, whether it's direct to consumer or wholesale markets, even just right size and market appropriate software solutions, whether it's inventory management, customer communication, how you process payment, the finding tools that are highly effective to support our team at the size and scale we're at, and the scope and focus we're at. I think there's a world of growth possible there, where moving from everything being really bespoke and custom built and with maybe a little more duct tape than you'd want, moving into the next chapter of that is something I'm eager to see, and where the sorts of people, the professions, the segments of our broader economy that can support that and will need to be part of that is going to, it's more than saying, oh, well, we need farmers doing this or that. There's all this wraparound support that I think is going to be, needed over the coming years.
Great. So I guess as a closing word here, what would be the call out to the companies or individuals that you'd want to be connected with that's going to move the work that LINC Foods is doing right now moving forward?
One of the things that we see, and I feel fortunate working in the craft beer industry, has really been reinforce something that I knew I valued, but I didn't know how much you get to practice it in your job, so to speak. It's a deeply collaborative industry, and where people are very committed to sharing what they know and working together and kind of crossing more traditional. It's like, well, you're my customer or I'm your customer kind of lines, that making sure that we're putting our heads together across our, regardless of what aspect of LINC's operation we're talking about, to share perspective and wisdom and resources. I think there's something to be said there that can help us be competitive in a broader market space. I think the other piece, and this is just speaking for myself, and I'm sure that in many ways this is common to whatever sort of small business or young businesses, looking for where there are opportunities, and whoever the listener is out there for helping build financial kind of literacy and savvy across companies like ours. Like we've got we're a team of, I think we're 11 or 12 employees that work for the co-op at this point. And we've got a couple folks who their day job is worrying about the dollars and cents, and they're super savvy. But I know for a lot of the rest of our team, the days are full and their backgrounds aren't necessarily in, how the balance sheet looks. But it's something where being effective as a small business, we all need to have that sort of competency. So, that's the sort of kind of resource and support. I've had a couple of conversations over the last few months with peers of mine outside of my, kind of immediate day-to-day, who I respect from that regard, and saying like, man, yeah, like, would you ever come and sit in on a meeting with me and a couple of my colleagues to talk through your experience doing this completely different thing, but where there could be some lessons learned? I think that there's like I said, this is probably the case for a lot of small businesses, but that's an area where this kind of growth and skill building is something that I think is probably going to be pretty important. Yep.
Great. All right, Brian Estes, LINC Foods. All right, where can folks follow along with your work and stay up to date on everything you're doing?
Yeah. So we've got both the food side as the terminology we use, but yeah, LINC Foods. Either .com or LINC Foods on social media. I think Instagram is probably the best place to go for hearing about from that side of the company. And then similarly, lincmalt.com and we've got some social media that we kick around too. Those are great places to electronically look out for us. But if you're ever in Spokane and want to tour a malting facility and share a beer, hit me up.
Love it. All right, Brian Estes, hit him up. Follow along the work. They're doing good stuff. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks, Don.